IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to All Things Policy. We're recording this at about 4 p.m. on the 31st of March 2021, and I'm here with Anirudh Kanisetti. These are the last few hours of Anirudh's very last day as a full-time fellow at Takshashila. Now, Anirudh will still retain an association with the institution, and he will still appear on this podcast every now and then. He and I also hope to collaborate on some projects in the months ahead. But before he heads out, I thought we could grab Anirudh for one last episode of this sort of All Things Policy. So welcome, Anirudh. And before we get to today's subject, I'm going to subject you to that old reporter's trope. Aapko kaisa mehsoos ho raha hai? How do you feel?
It's difficult to say, Aditya. It's been almost 4 years to the day. I think about 3 years and 11 months to be precise. Since I joined Takshashila, it's been an absolutely crazy journey, man. I graduated with an engineering degree in 2016 till May 2017. I was working as a data analyst at this place called Fractal Analytics, and then I did Takshashila as a graduate certificate in public policy, and I happened to write an essay for one of the assignments that Anupam gave me. So basically, the assignment was to give an example of price controls from anywhere in the world, and I noticed that there was a loophole there, which was that Anupam didn't mention when exactly in human history this example had to be from. So I wrote about price controls in the Delhi Sultanate under the reign of Alauddin Khilji, possibly one of the most elaborate price control systems ever designed in human history, and possibly one of the most effective as well. And that grabbed some eyeballs because applying modern economic reasoning to the dynamics of historical situations is not something that we very often do, especially in India. And that's really what led to a role as a research analyst in Takshashila, which led to an absolute roller coaster over the last years. I've worked on everything from gene editing governance to 5G governance, to India's China strategy, to researching various things about Chinese political economy, to talking about India's rare earth strategy. It's been an absolutely crazy journey. I've even through this whole process written a book which should be published in July, August about the history of the Deccan through 600 to 1100 or so, possibly the first popular history of the Deccan to come out in decades. We've started a podcast together, Aditya, Yuddha. I've started my own podcast, Echoes of India, which was surprisingly popular. I'm going to be leaving because I am joining the School of Oriental and African Studies in London at the end of the year for my master's in history. So all in all, I mean, I don't really know how I can answer your question in a single sentence. There's a whole mix of feelings. I'm sad, of course, that I will no longer be at Takshashila full time. I know damn well I'm going to miss everyone here. I'm also going to miss, of course, our listeners at All Things Policy, who are always so excited and keep asking us questions and sharing things with us. But it's not really the goodbye. It's a goodbye. I will still be appearing on All Things Policy, hosting Friday episodes every now and then, talking about history and other stuff that I happen to be interested in. Hopefully, there will be a few episodes with me in London as well, after I've rediscovered the wonders of the British Museum and so on. I'm excited. I'm a little apprehensive because, of course, it's a big change going to a whole new country, experiencing the history academic life, which is something that I've been dreaming about for years. It's going to be an interesting experience, but I'm going to miss the madcap schedules of Takshashila. As you know, making All Things Policy over the last few years has been something that's taken so much time from both of us. We've done so many episodes at the last minute, pulled so many ideas out of our hats at the very last minute. I'm going to miss being responsible and being a part of all that. And of course, All the best to you, to the rest of the team, and of course to all of our listeners. Though of course I'm not really going to be gone. But what are we going to be talking about today, Aditya? Aside from me going away, that is.
Well, we are going to miss you, man. Before we move to that topic, but we're also really happy for you. And yeah, I suspect we'll end up finding new ways of doing fun stuff together in the coming months.
Yeah.
But yeah, our subject today is really India's diplomacy in the 1950s. We're specifically looking at an agreement that has achieved what I would say is at least some ill-deserved notoriety. I'm talking, of course, about the Panchsheel Agreement, which was signed by India and China on the 29th of April, 1954. And Anirudh and I wrote a piece for Live History India about what drove India to sign this particular agreement. We also looked at whether the agreement deserves like all the opprobrium that it has that's been heaped on it in the decades since. And one thing that's really been missing from a lot of the popular discussion on India's foreign policy during this period has been historical context. And to the extent that any such context is allowed, it's largely focused on 1962, and understandably so, right? I mean, the shadow of that war and India's loss really loom back onto the 1950s, and they really frustrate many of our attempts at shedding light on the period. So I'd like to start today, Anirudh, by having you first set some historical context, right? In 1945, the bloodiest war in human history came to an end. And barely 2 years after that, this fatally weakened British Empire left India. And India then experienced its own bloody civil war at that same time, the historical event we refer to simply as partition. So, Anirudh, when India awoke to life and freedom at the midnight hour, Nehru had quite evidently been giving a lot of thought to India's foreign policy and what it ought to look like. Can you run us through those early years? What was the thinking behind them? And how did Nehru go about achieving India's foreign policy goals?
Well, like you said, Aditya, it was a pretty epical moment if we can actually kind of transport ourselves back to the late 1940s. Let's try to forget everything that we know about what would come in the future, and let's just imagine that we are the leaders of a profoundly impoverished nation that has had a considerable historical weight in the broader Asian region. Let us imagine that soon after escaping from the shackles of colonialism, as it were, we are once again in a situation where two global superpowers, the Soviet Union and the USA, are spreading their influence all across the world in not necessarily very pleasant ways that are honestly quite reminiscent of colonialism in a lot of ways. And we also know that to our north, arguably one of our most ancient historical partners, China, is going through a civil war of absolutely horrendous proportions. And let me just pause here to talk a little bit about what China really went through in the 19th and 20th centuries. To modern audiences, China is best known as essentially this totalitarian internet dictatorship, as it were, that is characterized by Xi Jinping and this very nationalist and very muscular kind of approach to foreign policy. And it's a little difficult to remember that this belligerence is very often justified by China in the name of what they call the Century of Humiliation. This is a period that starts in roughly the 1860s or so, with China's spectacular defeats in the Opium Wars, and continues until the middle of the 20th century, a period during which China went through arguably some of the most devastating conflicts in human history. So, if you think about, for example, the Taiping Rebellion, it's something that not a lot of folks know about, but this was basically a rebellion led by a Christian fundamentalist in southern China who believed that he was the brother of Jesus Christ, and essentially led a movement to overthrow the Qing dynasty, which led to the deaths of millions of Chinese people. Basically, we're talking about casualties at the level of the First World War in one of the most populous regions of the globe. And very soon after that trauma, you have the Qing dynasty collapsing, the establishment of the Republic of China, which very rapidly splinters into a whole bunch of different competing polities ruled by warlords, all of whom are going to war with each other. We see all these polities essentially being brutally attacked by the Japanese during the Second World War. We see this savage civil war between the communists and the Kuomintang, which finally leads to the establishment of the People's Republic of China in the early in the late 1940s. You really have to imagine that if you are Jawaharlal Nehru sitting in Delhi in 1947, it would be a pretty damn scary situation to imagine that the lives of millions of people in India lie in your hands. And to also, being Nehru, the kind of like historically inclined chap that he was, to also have this great sense of historical responsibility. In fact, Nehru's sense of history was so profound that, of course, he wrote a whole bunch of books about Indian history, but he was also quite a sympathizer with the People's Republic of China, because he believed that the Communist Party of China was expressing a genuine grievance held by the Chinese people, peasants and agriculturalists, after a century of savagery and many more centuries before that of imperial rule and misrule. So if you're Nehru, what do you really want to do? Your most important goal is to make sure that your country is united and somehow manage to stay independent through all the competitions and craziness of the Cold War. And how does Nehru go about doing this? Now, one strategy that he adopts is to have his ambassador to the United Nations who take up on a very kind of pugilistic and, if I can use that term, somewhat preachy tone on various global issues. So even though you would expect that India, a desperately poor, formerly colonized nation, would adopt a fairly hands-off foreign policy, instead what we see is that under Nehru, India instead is very active in the global fora. It's very insistent on the common cause of decolonization, as it were, really takes the moral high ground on a lot of issues. Now, the benefits of this policy are really debatable. On the one hand, they certainly gave India an extraordinary international stature, which was much more than you'd expect it to have, given its kind of economic and social conditions at the time. And it also did manage to stave off Western interference for a considerable degree of time, because of the sheer stature that this whole policy began to impart. On the other hand, this policy did not really win India a lot of friends. In fact, as the Congress leader J.B. Kripalani famously said, neutrality cannot be combined with the urge to reform the world. So, ironically, India was neutral on everything, but it was also taking on very reformist stances. Now, as the 1950s began to chug on, we can really see why exactly Nehru would have been so concerned about the potential for colonization becoming a problem again, because of the devastating Korean War, which saw the involvement of the USSR and the USA, almost bringing them to an open confrontation and bringing in the PRC into the conflict as well. And we also saw simultaneously that the People's Republic of China expanded into Xinjiang and Tibet, therefore suddenly and very abruptly making it India's neighbor. This despite the fact that Nehru's ambassador to China was damn sure that nothing of the sort was happening. There was a massive intelligence failure. Even though Sardar Patel at the time warned Nehru that the Chinese do not see India as their friends, Nehru was still fairly confident and fairly convinced that, look, the Chinese are a very important historical force in Asia. If India is to ensure that we are basically going to be, if India is going to ensure that a new era of colonization does not break out across the world, led by the USSR and the USA, we are going to need to wean China away from its close alignment with the USSR and basically create a kind of independent Asian pole, as it were. Which would help achieve India's long-term foreign policy interests. Of course, there were also a whole bunch of other personal reasons why Nehru may have thought this way. It certainly seems that Nehru was very convinced in this historical reasoning, believed that it was inevitable that China needed to re-enter the Brotherhood of Nations, as it were. And he was also fairly convinced that he understood China at a deeper level than most other Indian leaders did. This was partially because over the last few decades, Nehru had been very active in decolonizing circles. He was a major patron of the Pan-Asianist movement, which believed that India and China together could transform Asia in a very benevolent way. And of course, he had personal ties with the Chinese leadership as well. So, given all these factors, it kind of makes sense why Nehru would be a little more optimistic towards China than most other Indian leaders at the time might have been. And it was because of all of these factors, right? The dynamics of the Cold War, his own historical conviction, his own personal viewpoints on China and its role in history, that he would embark or really facilitate the agreement that has attracted, as you said, Aditya, so much opprobrium in recent years. But that is mostly because of what would eventually happen in 1962. In the early 1950s, as far as Nehru was concerned, entering into some kind of agreement with China that would reassure them, that would help really bring them back into the international community and establish a kind of stable relationship with India, really seemed to be in India's interest as well as Nehru's interests, because, of course, Nehru did enjoy portraying himself as a magnanimous statesman. So this is what leads us, of course, to the famous agreement called Panchsheel. So, Aditya, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what China's point of view was, because one of the arguments that we make in our piece is that the Chinese is that even though Nehru is very often given the credit for Panchsheel, Panchsheel was really a Chinese idea.
Yes, absolutely. Anirudh, there's a fair amount of evidence that Panchsheel was primarily a Chinese initiative. What's I think interesting is not just why the Chinese went for Panchsheel, but also why at that particular time India found it useful. Like you said, this was the 1950s was a remarkable historical time. So on the one hand, you have the end of this conflict, the Second World War, and you have the rise of this new sort of conflict, this new kind of confrontation between the Western and Eastern blocs. And this is happening at the same time as this other mega historical trend is coming to an end, which is really the end of what you might call the Columbian epoch, right? So the whole era from Vasco da Gama and the European maritime expansion in Asia and Africa also seems to be coming to an end. And these two trends are at loggerheads. And for both India and China see this and react to it in very different ways. China is an anti-imperial state, but it engages in imperialism of its own. What it has done ever since the end of its bloody civil war is expand. Like you said, it's expanded into Xinjiang, it's expanded into Tibet. And it's also from the year 1950 onwards fought in the Korean War. So, barely missing a beat. Like within barely a year of the end of the Civil War, they're at war in Korea directly with the Americans. So, China at this point does not have a particularly benign image. And China's leaders, brutal as they might be, did understand that they would have to reassure other states in Asia that they had nothing to fear from China. And so basically what the Chinese do is they go on this charm offensive. And there are enough discussions between Zhou Enlai and Mao to indicate that this was a very conscious effort. And one of the first countries that Zhou Enlai directs this idea to is India. And this happens in 1954 at the very end of a long negotiated agreement between the two countries. Now, at this time, by 1953, 1954, India had come to recognize that the Chinese were going to be in Tibet. They're not going to move away. There's no force that could militarily evict them from that place. They were certainly not going to be persuaded to suddenly leave Tibet. So India would have to recognize this reality. India would also have to give up some of the special privileges that it had inherited from the British Raj, that it enjoyed in Tibet. And so in 1954, India and China signed this agreement where India basically gives up some of these special privileges that it has in Tibet. It allows the Chinese to take over, for example, telegraph offices and facilities that India had at that time, at least nominally controlled in Tibet. And appended to this agreement is this little diplomatic curiosity, which talks about the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And, this is later rebranded in India as Panchsheel or Panchshila. But what does Panchsheel talk about? There are 5 principles. 5 principles are mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and 5th, peaceful coexistence. Now, broadly, these, what do these, principles really mean? Not much. They're fairly anodyne principles. They're very consistent with existing international law at that time. So what was it really about? It was really about India and China basically providing some sort of diplomatic reassurance to each other, uh, that they wouldn't have to necessarily worry so much about each other, at least for the time being. And so that's China's motivation. But why is India agreeing to this? Well, one is, of course, it now has China at its borders and it doesn't need that kind of trouble. The other is that India has its own concerns at this time. By 1954, it's clear that the United States is going to start supplying arms to Pakistan. Pakistan is India's only real adversary, and it's the only country that actively covets Indian territory, right? So India and Pakistan have already gone to war over Kashmir once in 1947-48, and Pakistan does claim all of Jammu and Kashmir. So you have this hostile state that is now going to receive arms from the United States. There's already India can already tell that in the works there are diplomatic wheels turning to create new military alliances in the region, which would basically be non-communist alliances that are backed implicitly or explicitly to various extents by the United States. And of course, this comes into being. So the Panchsheel Agreement is signed in April of 1954. Later that year, you have the signing of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, the so-called Manila Pact, with the signatories being the US, the UK, France, Thailand, Philippines, and Pakistan. Now, if you wonder why Pakistan is part of a Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, it's because Pakistan at that time has an eastern wing, what is now Bangladesh. Now, the following year, Pakistan also gets into what's called CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, the so-called Baghdad Pact, right? Baghdad Pact includes Britain, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, and Iraq. So by 1955, India is surrounded to its east and its west by these new military alliances. These military alliances have come into being barely a decade after the end of the Second World War, this incredibly costly conflict. And a founding member of both of these alliances is Pakistan, a country that actively uh, covets Indian territory. Now, you can imagine that at this point, it really makes sense for India to seek out agreements and understanding where it can with other countries. And so you do see, for example, in 1955, India becomes a very active proponent of non-alignment, or the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. Uh, and and it's in Indonesia, once again, that Nehru, as well as Chou En-lai, uh, advocate the five principles of Panchsheel as being a sort of new norm of international relations, at least among the newly decolonized states. So they're trying to limit the spread of these new competing poles in their own region, because those are a direct threat to the broader security of India. And they are also trying to create a new norm, which would, and they're also trying to create a sort of third pole of non-aligned countries, which are not going to fall into any of these categories, but will actually seek to find win-win solutions, to their problems.
What wonderful optimism! It's almost unthinkable that today India and China would clearly recognize their geopolitical and geoeconomic interests in that way and try to come to kind of mutual understanding, to kind of work it out. So it really feels like something that could only have been possible in the 1950s and 60s, where you not only had this coming together of all these factors, but also the fact that you had leaders who were inclined to like actually working something out together and who actually had some kind of personal relationship, some kind of trust between each other, right? But of course, this would all so spectacularly come to end in 1962, and it's very difficult to imagine that somebody in 1954, after the Bandung Conference, would have believed that India and China, who really seemed to be the foremost proponents of this kind of finding accommodations and being non-aligned in the global south, would someday actually be at war, and that they would not trust each other for decades after that. So how would that actually come to pass, Aditya? What led that moment of optimism, that moment of mutual understanding, to culminate in the 1962 war?
Yeah, Panchsheel was, I think, at best, I would say that, while you might criticize Nehru and others for optimism, there was a lot of realpolitik thinking in their approach. They were trying to limit the spread of potentially hostile military alliances. They were trying to buy time. And it's not like Nehru or any others in his cabinet were particularly naive about China and the potential dangers from China. There was also an agreement like Panchsheel also basically largely left unaddressed the political realities of Tibet. So by the late 1950s, there were two critical problems in the India China relationship. One was that they had a disputed boundary, the other was the political future of Tibet. While nobody expected the Chinese to be suddenly evicted from that region, China's political repression, social repression in that country was obviously going to lead to problems of other kinds. So in 1959, as a result of China's repression there, you had this large scale uprising in Tibet. That's also when the Dalai Lama fled to India, which then granted him asylum. And for Mao or for Zhou Enlai, this is an obvious violation of Panchsheel, right? So because you're violating the pledge to not interfere in another country's internal affairs. But what is really India's choice? Does India tell the Dalai Lama to just go back? It really didn't have that option. And so that's one leg of the new hostility that's rising between India and China. The other is, of course, the boundary. In 1959, that same year, you had these clashes at Longju, which is in Nifa, what is now Arunachal Pradesh, and in Ladakh, in Konka La Pass. And it's exactly that same time that in April 1960, Zhou Enlai visits India again. They hurriedly try to come to an agreement. The Chinese have proposals of their own, but those are not acceptable to India at this time. And really, the two sides don't make much progress. And it's not really very surprising that as these two political problems continue to boil, continue to fester, that it eventually leads to conflict. One really interesting factor during this period, which we couldn't get to in our article, was the extent to which the Soviets sought to restrain the Chinese. We know this thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center's Cold War History Project and the archival material that it has retrieved. And if you look at the transcripts of some of the meetings between the Soviets and the Chinese, you can really see the Soviets almost losing their patience with their fellow communists. They're telling them, so why did you have to go and kill Indian soldiers if you had this clash? There was absolutely no need to do it. Why are there no Chinese soldiers dead in these clashes? Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? So they're very frustrated by that sort of thing. They're also urging the Chinese to show much greater restraint towards India. They're also telling the Chinese the Indians can't be blamed for housing the Dalai Lama. They point out that, there were people who fled Kim Il Sung's regime in North Korea, and these people fled to both the Soviet Union and China, and both of these countries had provided asylum to those people. So, what's so egregious about India providing asylum to the Dalai Lama? So, you see the Soviets and especially Nikita Khrushchev making these arguments, trying to restrain the Chinese. And this is really, in a sense, a vindication of India's foreign policy. It's a vindication in that sense, not just of Panchsheel, but more importantly of non-alignment, of India seeking to balance relations between both the blocs, between both the Eastern and Western blocs. But of course, none of this is really enough. And it eventually leads to the conflict of 1962.
That's so fascinating. I had no idea the Soviets were doing all this with the Chinese. And I mean, Khrushchev is really is one of the most interesting Soviet politicians to my mind. A guy who was a miner or something, who rose up to become one of the most powerful men in the world. A very, very interesting character. I think he really lent a lot of flavor to the Cold War. And a lot of his foreign policy statements, at least to me sitting here in 2021, seem rather commonsensical. And yes, indeed, the way that Khrushchev puts it, it does seem like the Chinese were indulging their own fears and hypocrisy when they were in the lead up to the 1962 war. But that's a discussion for another day. Aditya, so Panchsheel is something that we so often talk about almost purely in India-China context, right? But it came out in a very globalized time. Surely, every other country in the world must have had various ideas on India's espousal of Panchsheel, especially given that in the decade before that, India had been essentially out there, the first to criticize any country on not conducting its internal matters in a way that adhered to our moral high grounds. So, how exactly was Panchsheel received by the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. Both before Panchsheel and after Panchsheel, India continued to punch above its weight, continued to be preachy, and that managed to irritate a lot of countries. But immediately the moment you espouse something like Panchsheel, it's going to open you up to charges of hypocrisy, right? So barely a year after the Bandung conference, you have this major crisis in October, November. A dual crisis, really. So, on the one hand, the British and French have gone and seized the Suez Canal from Egypt, and this is happening simultaneously with a Israeli charge into the Sinai Desert. At the same time, you have this other festering crisis in Eastern Europe, within the Eastern Bloc, where there's an uprising in Hungary led by Imre Nagy, and the Soviet tanks roll into the country to put down the uprising. So, on the one hand, you have the British and the French going on the one hand, you have the British and French basically undertaking this totally neo-colonial undertaking, and on the other, you have the Soviets, the so-called anti-imperialists, basically rolling into another country and trying to prop up a government of their own choice. Obviously, both are violations of Panchsheel, but India India shows a great deal of alacrity in condemning the capture of the Suez, but its condemnation or criticism, at least, of the Soviet action is delayed. And that period of a few weeks of delay really opens up India to a lot of criticism. And there's a wonderful, weird, interesting first-person account by this very influential Canadian diplomat, Escott Reed. He wrote a book that was simply called Hungary and Suez. And this was his take on how this dual crisis was viewed from New Delhi. And his broad conclusion was that for India and specifically for Nehru, colonialism only meant the rule of a colored people by a white people. And this was a fairly common view in the West, that this was a blind spot among Indians. There might be some truth to that, but I would also once again hasten to add that there was a realpolitik reason for India to delay its criticism of the Soviet Union. India knew that it needed the Soviets for some very specific purposes, like I mentioned earlier, to restrain the Chinese where possible. India was also drawing investments, for example, from the Soviets. So, there was a lot of good sense in India, trying to figure out what exactly was happening in Hungary, to not make a lot of public statements so that perhaps it could maybe come in and help negotiate and diffuse this crisis. So it wasn't necessarily the hypocrisy that a lot of Western countries saw. Now, within a few years of this, really 5 years of this, there's another Indian action. India carries out its own anti-imperial action, which is the seizure of Goa in 1961. And once again, you do have this immediate criticism of India from the West. Hey, you guys, you're the ones who said we shouldn't use force at Suez, right? So how come you're using force in Goa? And Indians are at pain to point out that this was, a remnant of the colonial period. These people are our own people. We're basically fighting for freedom. But all these sort of actions basically make it difficult for India to sustain that moral high ground. And you can see by the late 1950s and early 60s that the charm that was associated with India's moral high ground was definitely wearing off. And Panchsheel probably bears some of the blame for that.
How fascinating. As always, history is far more complicated than we like to believe, isn't it? It's so easy to dismiss India's foreign policy up to 1962 as just being about woolly-headed optimism. But as we've pointed out through this discussion, even India's sanctimony on the global stage, if I can use that term, had a very calculated reason behind it. Um, Under Nehru, India's foreign policy would make some profoundly uncomfortable choices in a time of very profound global turbulence and churn. And the fact that India came through all of it relatively whole, with only one major war with an external power, is quite frankly impressive given the sheer chaos of the times. I think, in conclusion, what we can say is that the Panchsheel represents a very specific era in Indian foreign policy, something that happened as a result of particular global factors, personal factors, political factors, that very quickly lost their relevance, though it's often trotted out today as one of the reasons for the failure of Indian foreign policy in the 1962 war. And up to this very day, I still see papers coming across. I still come across papers which talk about Panchsheel's failures and its applications and how it has been adhered to or not adhered to. I think that's something that I think what's important to keep in mind is that, like everything that is done, like everything in history, this thing needs to be seen within its context. You cannot ascribe the success or failure of a policy to one specific individual or one specific policy at any point in human history. And the Panchsheel is a great example of that. Aditya, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say that, like we kept pointing out, 1962, cast this big shadow on Panchsheel, right? Why does 1962 cast this big shadow? At its heart, 1962 was a strategic surprise. Strategic surprises are not unusual. They are, unfortunately, a fact of life in international relations. It was not the only time India has been surprised as such. At the very least, India was as surprised in 1999 during the Kargil War. The difference is that India won in Kargil and lost in 1962. And when you win, the surprise doesn't seem to matter as much. There aren't as many recriminations. But the fact that India lost in 1962 has led to a lot of, half-baked, half-informed recriminations and analysis of the conflict, and trying to cast blame on some of the diplomatic initiatives that were actually carried out in the 1950s, which I think are misplaced. I would just leave you with that thought. What if India had won in 1962? Or if India had perhaps drawn the war in 1962, would we still be looking at Panchsheel in the same way?
I don't think we would. I think we might very well be holding it up as a profound and marvelous example of how Buddhist principles can lead to stability in the world today. Everything depends on how our interpretation of historical facts is often colored by the present that we live in today. And I think that living in a present after the profound humiliation of 1962, and constantly under the shadow, as it were, of Chinese aggression on the borders, it's kind of understandable that we would choose to interpret it this way. But as you said, Aditya, if history had worked out slightly differently, we might think of it in a rather different sense. So we hope that our discussion today helped you get a better sense of what Panchsheel really was in its own time, on its own merits. There will be a link to our Peace for Life History India in the description, of course, so please check that out. All Things Policy listeners, it's been a real pleasure working at Takshashila, reaching out to you guys almost every Friday. Please keep in touch, and I look forward to hearing from all of you. And I will see you on All Things Policy once again very soon.
Thank you so much, Anirudh, and we'll have more such conversations in the future again. Just a programming note, we will not have an episode on Friday, the 2nd of April. It's Good Friday. We will be back, of course, as usual, on Monday, the 5th of April. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Siet Tires and The Whole Truth Foods. We really appreciate the support. So this week, tune into This Round is on Me with Gauri Devidayal. She invited Sonal Holland, India's only master of wine, and they discussed the goodness and business of wine, the pros and cons of being women in the hospitality business, and motherhood. On The Traveling Professor, Siddharth Deshmukh looks at evolution of search and wonders how voice search might change things yet again. On Advertising is Dead, Varun Dugirala featured Anirudh Singla of Pepper Content. He shared his perspective on the term content and how he sees it going forward. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vinny spoke to Ayushman Sinha, head of Represent, a music talent management agency. He spoke about life as a manager and about nurturing new talent and paving a progressive career path for them. On Cyrus Says, we had entrepreneur, businesswoman, and Ruckus Avenue radio host Alexandra Masur. They discussed ethnicity, life as Desi American, Seema Auntie's matchmaking show, and a lot of other fun stuff. Also, IVM has an hour every Sunday on the Ruckus Avenue Radio Network, a US-based radio station that caters to the South Asian community. It's available on Dash Radio, and you can catch the episodes on the IBM Likes feed every Monday. On The Habit Coach with Ashton Doctor, Ashton asks us to commit to sleep and prioritize it over every party, work deadline, or binge watch session, as it is a crucial time when the body slows down for maintenance and recovery. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
2020 is a difficult year. A global pandemic, protests, elections, recessions, you get the picture. What we need is a space where we can have nuanced discussions about global affairs and foreign policy. That's where I come in. My name is Hamsini Hariharan and I host the States of Anarchy podcast. Every second Tuesday, I speak to experts in the field of international relations to make a little more sense of the world. So join me on the IVM podcast app, website, or wherever you're listening to me right now.